The limbic system, this is page 120. The limbic system is different from any of the other parts of the brain because it's not an anatomic area. The cerebellum is an actual structure of the brain. The medulla oblongata is an actual structure of the brain, but the limbic system, and it's the only one of these brain parts of the brain that has that word system in it. It is a neural network. It is a network of neurons associated with many different anatomic parts of the brain. Now, the limbic system, this is a mid-sagittal section through the brain, right down the middle. And the area that is shaded in black comprise what we call the limbic system. It includes a number of different anatomic parts of the brain. I wrote up here in the outline that the limbic system includes parts of the olfactory areas of the brain. What's olfaction, olfactory? Sense of smell. So it involves parts of the brain associated with the sense of smell. Here you can see it says olfactory area or bulb. It includes parts of the cerebrum or cerebral cortex. You don't have to know cingulate gyrus of cerebrum, but this area is part of the cerebrum. Yeah, the limbic system includes parts of the thalamus. This is the thalamus right here. It includes parts of the hypothalamus right in here, just above the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus, and it includes an area called the amygdaloid nucleus of the basal ganglia. So the limbic system is made up of a bunch of neurons that interconnect a number of different anatomic parts of the brain. Now, what they found is that the limbic system is fundamentally involved in emotions. Fascinating area, and we really don't understand this very well. First question you might have is, how the hell did we figure out that it's involved in emotions? So we kind of learned this in two ways. First, they have done brain studies where they stimulate different parts of this so-called limbic system, and the person who they're stimulating these parts of the brain will say they feel, it creates feelings in them. It causes them to feel sad, it causes them to feel happy, it causes them to feel mad. Incidentally, as a side note, you may or may not know this, but whenever somebody's having brain surgery, the patient is awake. Because when they're working on the brain, they want to be able to ask that person questions. Now you might say, well, wait a second, how can they have the person be awake? Interestingly, there are no pain sensory neurons in the brain. You've got pain sensory neurons all over your body, but none in the brain. And they want to be able to ask the person questions. They want to stimulate parts of the brain. If I stimulate this part of your brain, can you feel any sensations coming from your foot? That would be in the primary sensory area that normally receives information from the foot. All right, so anyhow, by asking people who are awake during brain surgery, when they stimulate different parts of the limbic system, they've learned that it's associated with emotions. And the second way we learn, and I mentioned this before, is seeing what happens to people who have suffered injury to this limbic system. And that affects them emotionally, among other things. So stimulating different parts of the limbic system creates various feelings or emotions. When they stimulate some areas, the person says they feel really happy. Some parts of the limbic system cause euphoria. Euphoria is great joy. In fact, stimulating some parts of the limbic system, the person says it feels better than an orgasm. Stimulate other parts of the limbic system, it causes anger. Stimulating other parts of the limbic system, it causes fear. Stimulating other parts of the limbic system, it causes sadness. So that's how they've learned what the limbic system is about. Now, I wrote here next that your emotional state, whether you're happy or sad, can affect your general level of alertness, how alert you are. And I want to just point this out. If we look at our chart on page 108, so on our chart on page 108, here's the thalamus, which is also known as the waking center. The thalamus is involved, plays a role in whether we're awake or asleep. And here's the limbic system, the emotional center. And I have an arrow showing that there is wires wires meaning neural connections between the limbic system, the center of emotions. We said it's wired into the thalamus. So your emotional state can affect whether you feel like being awake or you feel like you want to sleep. So I'll just very quickly give you an example of what I mean. So let's imagine that you're applying for a clinical program. So let's imagine one day, it's around March, April, May, when they're sending out these letters commonly, and you're really tired, it's been a tough day, whether it's work or school or whatever, and you come home and you look at the mailbox. Oh, there's a letter from the program. All right. Now, the common thing they'll say is, well, is it a small envelope or is it a large envelope? But let's say whatever size it is, you're really tired, you tear it open, all right? And you start to read the letter. It says, "Dear so-and-so, we regret to inform you that we were unable to accept you into our program. There are many very qualified individuals, and we wish you lots of luck." Yeah. All right, so how do you feel? Sad. And when we're sad, emotionally, right, first you got the information of rejection. That is wired into the cerebral cortex, limbic system, and that makes you sad. And when we're sad, we feel like we want to sleep a lot. We deal with sadness and depression by sleeping. That's how we heal. That's how we get better. So anytime people are sad and depressed, they sleep a lot. You usually want to be by yourself, right? If you just got some bad news, you probably just want to be by yourself, open up a big container of Ben & Jerry's ice cream, and eat an entire container of ice cream and then just go to sleep. All right? So you don't feel really social or anything like that. Okay, so that's how it's affecting. Now let's tell the story a little bit differently. All right? So what if, you're really tired and you come home and you go to the mailbox and there's an envelope. Okay, it's from the program you're interested in. Okay, you tear open the letter, start to read the letter. "Dear so-and-so, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into the class of 20, whatever year it is, accepted into the class of this clinical program." All right, I'll just finish reading the letter. "In addition, we are pleased to inform you have been awarded the Dean's Scholarship, which covers all expenses for the next 2 years." Now, you came home very tired. Do you think you're going to go to sleep early? You couldn't sleep if you wanted to. No matter how tired you were, you are exhilarated. Your excitement and happiness and euphoria are keeping you wired. This is where you're going to get on the phone and call everybody you like. You're going to call your mother, you're going to call your best friend, right? You know what happened today? You're going to call some enemies. Guess what happened to me today? All right, but anyhow, so all we're trying to do, I'm making a big story out of something simple, simply that your emotions affect whether you feel like you want to sleep or whether you are exhilarated and can't sleep and want to stay awake. Back where we were on page 120, so that's what I wrote here. Anxiety, fear, excitement, anger increase your level of alertness. Depression and sadness tend to cause sedation or drowsiness. Another thing that's wired into the limbic system is what we call in the world of sports the big mo. Big mo means motivation. Motivation is the passion about doing something. And that's really emotional, motivation and passion. Also wired into the limbic system, especially this area called the hippocampus, which is right in here. You don't have to know it, but some of you may have heard of the hippocampus. The hippocampus, which is wired into the limbic system, is associated with memory and learning. And that is, and you might first of all wonder, well, what's memory and learning got to do with the limbic system? And the connection, what connects it is passion, motivation. If you have passion and motivation for learning, you can learn. If you're not passionate and have no motivation to learn, you won't learn. In other words, physiology is not an easy subject. Okay, we got that. But if you at least find this interesting, wow, physiology is really interesting how the body works. And I really would like to know more about it. And even though it's difficult, I find this really interesting. That motivates you to want to learn. If you simply are hearing this stuff on physiology and going, I don't care about this. I hate this. I don't like any of this. Why do I have to know this? You're not passionate for it. You're not interested in it. You're not motivated to learn. That's going to make it much more difficult to learn. So, that's why it's always important to be interested and passionate in whatever you're trying to learn, because that makes it easier to learn. If we look on page 123, I'll come back to 121 in a moment. On page 123, now we said that the limbic system was wired into the olfactory areas associated with the sense of smell. So you might ask, well, what's the olfactory, the sense of smell, got to do with the emotional center, the limbic system? And the answer is that odors, smells, affect us emotionally more than any other sensory modality. We just mentioned that the limbic system is associated with, at the hippocampus, memory. So smells affect us emotionally, and they elicit or trigger memories in us. So I'll give you two quick examples. Let's imagine you grew up in a home where you had a Christmas tree every Christmas time. So every time it's Christmas and you have a Christmas tree in a house, the smell of it brings back all kinds of feelings and emotions and memories of when you were younger. I'll give you another example. Let's imagine that you used to go with somebody, used to date somebody, and they wore a particular perfume or aftershave. You broke up with them. You're no longer with them. But every time you smell that perfume or aftershave, you're going to remember that person. Because that smell more powerfully creates memories or triggers memories in us than even more powerfully than seeing a picture of that person is the smell that you connect with it. So smells are very powerful elicitors of feelings and emotions. And it's connected to memories, and it's also connected to sexual behavior. It's not surprising sexual behavior is wired into the limbic system, because that's tied in with emotions. When we think of the sense of smell, just think about the names of perfumes, like ecstasy or obsession. I mean, why would you have a perfume called obsession unless the whole idea is I'll put this on and they won't be able to get their mind off me, right? They'll obsess about me constantly. Or ecstasy, just put this on and wow. So, all right, so that's sexual behavior. Also, we know that there is only one sensory modality that has a built-in emotion: pain. Pain causes in all of us suffering. We all want to avoid, all normal people want to avoid pain. So it has a built-in emotion. There's no other sensory modality that has a built-in emotion. In other words, if I showed you a color, let's say I projected the color red, some of us would say I like red, and some of us would say I don't like red. So it's not universal as far as how we feel about the color red. Some of us would say I like the color blue better. If we played music, so if I was playing classical music, some of us would say, oh yeah, I like classical music. Other people would say, I hate classical music. So we can't all agree on colors. We can't agree on music. We can't agree on smells. Smells create feelings and emotions, but it doesn't create the same emotion. Some of us like the smell of gardenias. Some of us like the smell of jasmine. Some of us like the smell of roses. So we won't agree as far as which smell we like the best or which smells we don't like. I happen to like the smell of gasoline. I don't think does anybody else like the smell of gasoline? All right, so there are a couple of other people. Most people don't like it. But obviously that's not a built-in feeling that's universal. But for pain, nobody likes pain. Is there anybody who likes pain in the class? No, okay. If you do, there's something off. And there are people who do have that off. All right? So now, as far as clinical considerations, so what is rabies? You probably have heard of rabies. It's a virus that infects the brain. And it specifically destroys, and we've talked about how lytic viruses cause rupturing of cells. We had mentioned how the polio virus enters and breaks apart somatic motor neurons. So the person loses their ability for skeletal muscular movement. Well, the rabies virus specifically penetrates and destroys neurons in the amygdaloid nucleus of the limbic system. The amygdaloid nucleus, and I'm not going to ask you to remember the amygdaloid nucleus, just say limbic system. But the amygdaloid nucleus of the limbic system is associated with anger and rage. Where is it? Again, I'm not testing you on it. It's located right in here. But why it's relevant or interesting is that if you look on page 121, on page 121, I wrote a short article that I included about the story of Charles Whitman. Now, most of you would not know who Charles Whitman was, but I remember this story when I was younger because he was attending the University of Texas at Austin. It was a summer session, and it was August 1st. And let's just say that Charles Whitman got off to a bad start on August 1st of the year 1966. What he did is he woke up and murdered his wife. He was a married student attending the college, and he murdered his wife. He then got in his car and murdered his mother. Then he had a number of guns with him, and he went to the bell tower, the tall clock tower building at the University of Texas at Austin, and he shot 38 people. 38 people. Now, they brought in a helicopter with a SWAT team, and they gunned him down. And they did an autopsy on his brain. Now, you might wonder, why did they do an autopsy on his brain? There was some interest in finding out more about why he had gone like crazy. And, you know, you gotta be pretty crazy. I think everybody would agree if you murdered both your mother and your wife, you know, both, as well as a bunch of unknown people to you. He had actually been going to the health center for months and months and meeting with a counselor because he was saying that he had increasing anger control problems. He was having increasing difficulty controlling his anger. So they did an autopsy of his brain, and he had a tumor growing in the amygdaloid nucleus of his limbic system. The tumor that was growing there, that's the exact same place in the brain where the rabies virus enters and destroys, and it causes the classic mad dog or, you know, rabid animal phenomenon where it goes uncontrollable. If you can read the story about Charles Whitman. It's really interesting. And incidentally, it also, I think, underlines something else. There's a big difference between psychologists and physiologists. Now, I'm interested in psychology. Psychologists are interested in physiology. But we do have a disagreement as far as where the emphasis is. The psychologists want to talk about how, you know, they want to sit down, you're lying down on a couch, and they'll say, so what was your relationship with your mother? You know, did you have a good relationship with your father? And they want to discuss that as far as your behavioral problems. The physiologists want to look at neurochemical imbalances. Are the neurotransmitter levels right? Is there a tumor growing in the brain? Now, these are not mutually exclusive, but physiologists and physicians, doctors, are of the opinion that before we worry about behavioral issues, let's rule out that there aren't pathologies, tumors growing in the brain, diseases of the brain, or neurotransmitter imbalances. After we know that those are okay, then we'll deal with counseling. But no amount of counseling for Charles Whitman could have overcome a tumor growing larger and larger in his brain every day. And now this was back before they had MRIs. Today, they should have, and hopefully would, send that person in to get an MRI, a magnetic resonance image of their brain to see was there anything abnormal about that brain. All right, so you can take a look at the story. It's kind of interesting. Back on page 123. So on 123, what's schizophrenia? Schizophrenia is a serious disorders, psychiatric disorder. The person has antisocial behavior. Schizophrenia is known to be genetic. There is a 90% correlation, 90% out of 100%, that if there are identical twins, if one of them is schizophrenic, a 90% probability the other twin is also schizophrenic. In other words, it's strongly correlated with genetics. It runs in families, and it is associated with abnormally elevated dopamine neurotransmitter levels in their limbic system. These increased levels of dopamine in their limbic system affect them emotionally. Now, not every person who is schizophrenic is violent. I want to emphasize that. Not everybody who has schizophrenia, which schizophrenia is the person they can't interact with other people socially in a normal way. It's not autism. Autism is also similar to that, but it's different. But they don't relate normally. So not everybody who's schizophrenic is violent, but a disproportionate people who are violent have schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a serious disorder, mania and depression. Depression is sadness, and it's a form of sadness where somebody wants to be by themselves and sleep a lot to heal. All of us get sad and depressed, mostly because of losses, of bad news, right? And when you suffer a loss, you were fired from a job, you didn't do well on an exam, you break up with the person you were seeing. Okay, so that everybody has that, and totally normal to feel sad and depressed. And the good news is almost everybody gets better over time. Time heals. But part of what's going to allow us to heal is sleeping. Now, if that's depression, a manic state is an impulsive state, an agitated state. It's where somebody is actually kind of in your face and really wants to be social, and they act impulsively. You know, you might get together, hey, guys, go, let's go to Vegas right now. Well, like, don't you have a class to go to, like, in a couple of hours, and you're having an exam? I know, but we're going to go real fast, and we'll come right back. Let's go. So, you know, that kind of thing. And there are people who go back and forth between this agitated manic state, where they're hyper, and the depressed state. And they call them manic depressants or bipolar disorder. We do notice that there are changes in their neurotransmitter levels. People who are manic have elevated catecholamine, neurotransmitter levels in their limbic system, and people who are depressed commonly will have decreased catecholamine neurotransmitter levels, norepinephrine levels in their limbic system. So, in fact, many of the antidepressant drugs are designed to elevate those catecholamine neurotransmitter levels. We mentioned that. Amphetamine mimics norepinephrine. It's a stimulant. It's an upper, right? Methamphetamine. That's why people take it. You can take MAO inhibitors, which inhibit the enzyme that breaks down norepinephrine and epinephrine so that these catecholamine neurotransmitter levels in the brain rise. I also mentioned just going on a roller coaster. That'll cause the release of adrenaline, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. That should make you elevate your mood, at least briefly. So that's depression. Now, manic states, they've got too much norepinephrine. They actually need to slow things down. So they commonly use lithium as a drug. Anyhow, that's the manic and depressive state. Now, this is the old chicken and egg question. You know, what comes first? The behavioral problem leads to neurotransmitter problems, or what physiologists and most doctors believe, neurotransmitter problems lead to behavioral problems. In the case of schizophrenia, the drugs they give lower the dopamine levels. They lower the dopamine levels to counteract the schizophrenia, which is associated with elevated dopamine levels in the limbic system. The problem is when you give drugs that lower the dopamine levels in the limbic system, they also lower it in other parts of the brain. And when you have abnormally low levels of dopamine in the basal ganglia, that creates Parkinson's disease. So what's interesting is when you're giving treatment for schizophrenia, the person starts to develop tremors. When somebody has Parkinson's and you need to increase the dopamine levels, they start to develop schizophrenia. We don't know how to just, right now, increase or decrease the neurotransmitter levels in only certain parts of the brain. But we are getting closer to that as we're starting to learn if the dopamine neurotransmitter receptor sites that are in the limbic system can be found to be different from those in the basal ganglia, then they can use specific drugs that either activate or block those dopamine receptor sites in specific parts of the brain, if they find that those receptor sites are different. Now let's go to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the last area of the brain that I talk about in this brain section. And even though it's a small area of the brain, from the perspective of this course in physiology, it's arguably the most important part of the brain. First off, the hypothalamus, which in this picture is located up here, is connected to the pituitary gland. And there are both neural connections, neurons that connect between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and there are blood vessels that carry blood between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And I mentioned that right here. There's both neural connections and a profuse network of capillaries called the hypothalamic pituitary portal system. On the next page, page 124, what is the hypothalamus involved in? So first off, the hypothalamus on page 124 has a number of very important control centers. This is where you remember is the temperature control center, the Thermoregulatory Reflex Center. Its job is to maintain our body temperature at about 37 degrees centigrade or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Also in the hypothalamus is an appetite satiety control center. You'd say, what's that? Appetite is a physiological drive to eat, to raise your blood sugar level. Satiety, you'd say, yeah, what's satiety? Satiety is like the word satiated or satisfied. Satisfied. It's when you do not have a physiologic drive to eat. So whether you have this drive to eat, appetite, or you don't have, you're satisfied and don't have a drive to eat, you're satiated or satisfied, that there's a control center, and its job is to try to regulate your blood sugar level at about 100 milligrams per deciliter. 100 milligrams of glucose per 100 milliliters of blood, or deciliter. So it's regulating your blood sugar level. This brain center is under intense research right now because we think that abnormalities in this control center may lead to compulsive eating, overeating, obesity, anorexia, where you don't eat, and all that. So they're doing a lot of research on this area of the hypothalamus. Also in the hypothalamus is an osmoregulatory or reflex center or thirst reflex center. It regulates the tonicity of our body fluids at 300 milliosmolar. Does that sound familiar? That's to keep, it ensures that our body fluids are kept isotonic. And so when our body fluids become hypertonic, you have a physiological drive to drink water, right? You become thirsty. When you become hypotonic, it creates commonly a physiological drive for salt, right? Because you're too hypotonic, you want to add solutes. So this craving or physiological drive for thirst or salt is because driven by this osmoregulatory or thirst reflex center. There's another control center. I didn't write it here, but we're going to get to it. So I'll just mention it right now. On page 126, on 126, just at the top, there's also a control center in the hypothalamus called, I'm going to call the Parturition Milk Let-Down Reflex Center. Now the books like to call this center the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus. But calling it the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus is not really informative. We're going to call it the Parturition Milk Let-Down Reflex Center. That's in the hypothalamus. Anybody know what parturition means? Parturition is the clinical word for childbirth. And milk letdown, that's the release of milk from the breasts. So the reflex center, the control center that initiates childbirth, that is going to initiate labor contractions, and the same center is also involved in the release of milk from the breast. So this is a control center in the hypothalamus. We'll come back to that. Back on the previous page, 124. Now, the hypothalamus also modulates the activity of lower reflex centers in the medulla oblongata and in the spinal cord. And if you're thinking, like, what does that mean? So as we had seen on page 108, we have a diagram that shows that what's going on in the hypothalamus can affect control centers in the medulla oblongata. So some examples of that, as we wrote on page 124, is that the hypothalamus can affect the cardiovascular reflex center and the swallowing and vomiting reflex centers that are in the medulla oblongata. In addition, the hypothalamus can affect the Parturition reflex center and the defecation reflex centers in the spinal cord. And if you're thinking, what are those? Would it be helpful if I said number 1 and number 2? So the control of urination, also known as Parturition, and the control of defecation, of having a bowel movement, these are control centers actually in the lower part of our spinal cord, but they are modulated, they are affected by the signals from the hypothalamus. Now the hypothalamus, as we've said on page 108, is regarded as the highest control center over our internal organs, specifically over the autonomic motor neurons that control our internal organs. So that's what we wrote in the middle of page 124. The hypothalamus adjusts the activity of our visceral organs, our internal organs, to match our physical activity and energy requirements of the person so that they match. In other words, if you're resting, we know the parasympathetic autonomic motor neurons are activated by the hypothalamus. If you are running for your life, the hypothalamus activates the sympathetic response, the sympathetic autonomic motor neurons, to power up the body to perform at a higher level. Now, in addition, there are hypothalamic neurons that release neurotransmitters into the bloodstream and act as hormones. And if you're thinking, what did you just say? You remember how we learned that epinephrine, adrenaline, is actually a neurotransmitter released by sympathetic autonomic motor neurons into the bloodstream. So epinephrine is a neurotransmitter, but since it circulates in the bloodstream and affects the body that way, it can also be described as a hormone. So it's a neurotransmitter hormone. When we mentioned that, I told you it wasn't the only one. So here we're going to be learning 2 more neurotransmitter hormones. One of them is called antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. And the other one, if we look on page 126, on the bottom of 126, the other is called oxytocin. And yes, we've mentioned it before.